I'm wearing a really thick sweater today because it's actually quite cold here in Lisbon. For the temperature at night, it was 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which means that it was a little over freezing. So in Celsius, that's just a few degrees. And in Portugal, we have what's kind of a typical apartment here, which means we have no air conditioning. We're relatively close to the ocean, but we also have no heat either. So when it gets really quite cold, we have to wear a lot of sweaters and possibly a portable heater. So that's very different than what you find in the US, which is usually most of the properties are equipped with at least heat as a kind of a minimum, and then also air conditioning if it's in a really hot or humid climate. So today I wanted to talk with you about what the latest statistics from the National Institute of Portugal were for home sales. And this is for the Q3 2024. They were just released a couple weeks ago during the holidays. And it's really interesting because if you go back a year ago, CaixaBank had predicted a 2% drop in the price of housing in 2024. So we're going to take a look at that and see if that's really what happened today here on Valley of the Dolly. So a year ago in Q3 2023, CaixaBank made a prediction that the cost of homes would drop by 2% in Portugal. And it was based on the assumption that there was, yes, very strong demand and there was still a low supply of housing. But because of the high interest rates, a lot of people would be kept out of the markets. And those who wanted to buy a house or a condo would be forced to buy a property smaller than they normally would want because of the high interest. So their payments, a lot more of it would be going towards interest and a lot less of it towards principal. So a lot of people would want to stay out of the market in this kind of situation, waiting for things to improve. And also they predicted that the volume of properties being sold, or they anticipated it would be 20% below those levels in 2022. And even at 2023, when this report was done, they were already, I believe it was 9%, the number of units that were sold had already fallen year over year 9%. So there was really reason to believe that this was going to kind of lead to this slowdown. And I kind of thought also that maybe we would see this kind of similar effect, especially since we had just seen the elimination of NHR, which is a non-habitual residency program, in its original form. And this meant that there would be fewer people coming in who would be interested in buying property because the tax consequences for doing so would be really quite hard. So I anticipated probably that what CaixaBank was saying would be true, that we would see a slowdown. But what happened? Well, interest rates, instead of remaining high, they've been dropped by the European Central Bank. So they've gone down 2%. And then you also see that it's anticipated in 2025 that they'll drop at least by 1%. So right now they're at 3%, and it's possible that they will go as low as below 2%, which is kind of what they consider kind of this cutoff inside of the market. And why are they anticipated on going lower? Well, it's anticipated that they'll have to drop those interest rates because they want to make sure that the economies in Europe do not fall into a recession and that demand remains strong. So if interest rates are very low, as they were depressed for years and years, where they were basically zero in the EU, you're going to see those interest rates potentially go down, at least down to the 2% level. By most accounts, the Portuguese economy is really doing quite well. In 2024, in 2025, and 2026, it's anticipated that the Portuguese economy will grow more or less about 2%. This is stronger than at least 50% of the economies in the EU. If you look at this chart, you'll see that in Portugal's number, it's about at least 50% over what a number of the other countries were, and including Germany, which is really Europe's strongest economy, that actually contracted in 2023-24, and you're seeing what is coming out of that into a stronger resurgence, but still it doesn't compare to the strength of the Portuguese economy. And you have a 2% growth rate. You also find that the Portuguese government has in the last year begun to run a surplus. So the tax, which is not certainly true in the United States, you're finding that the tax revenue is actually stronger than the financial demands that are being made on the government. And if you look at how much debt the Portuguese government owed as a percentage of GDP, in 2020, the debt was 134% of GDP, which is really quite high, higher than what you see in the United States and most developed countries. and since 2020, that debt as a proportion of GDP has continued to drop. And it's anticipated that by the end of 2025, it'll be lower than what it is at the end of 2024, which is 95.7%. And I believe it's expected to drop to 95% or even lower. So it's a dramatic decrease in the amount of debt that the Portuguese government is carrying compared to the gross domestic product, or the GDP. So the financial planning of the government has been very successful in creating a balanced budget, having a surplus, and also reducing the amount of debt as compared to the GDP. But you see the Portuguese government and the economy also has a very low unemployment rate right now, which has really helped. And we're also seeing inflation running at about 2.5%. And it's anticipated that over the next 2 years, by 2026, the inflation rate for Europe, for the European Union countries, will run about 2%. Now, Portugal could run higher and lower, that it really depends on. But overall, they anticipate that for the EU, the inflation rate will be about 2%. And this is important because this affects how much the interest rates will be per the European Central Bank, which affects what the interest rates will be for Portugal and for the banks who are issuing loans in Portugal. And it's possible that in 2025, interest rates will be dropped as low as 2% by the European Central Bank, and that 2% is really considered what's to be the neutral rate for interest. So anything below that is really quite low. And yes, it is true that if you go back before COVID, you saw interest rates were hovering around zero, but that's not really considered healthy. If the economies are doing well, interest rates would be at least 2%, if not higher. So if those loan rates continue to go down, it'll have a huge effect in Portugal. And why do we talk about that? Because the Portuguese economy is really sensitive to interest rates. Why? Because 60% of the loans that are being issued as variable rate loans, which means if inflation goes roaring back up and interest rates go roaring back up, the rate on the home loan will follow it, and it'll continue to rise as well. But if interest rates set by the ECB, the European Central Bank, continue to be lowered as inflation goes down, you'll see that those loan rates will also be very low for Portugal. So even though there'll be variables, it'll be great news for Portugal and for people who are borrowing money here. So let's look at what the results were from the Portuguese Institute of Statistics for the third quarter. And they show that year over year, housing prices in Portugal increased by 10%. This is really quite astounding, I thought. 10% is a huge increase in 1 year, and it tells you that it's increasing much faster than inflation. So the real value of property has continued to increase quite dramatically. So we've seen a 10% increase in the price of properties in Portugal. We've also seen over a 20% increase in the number of units that were being sold this quarter. And that may sound incredible, but there's been, over the last 2 years, a really depressed number of home sales because of those high interest rates. So you're now seeing, with the lower interest rates, the number of homes that are being sold has increased finally, which is good news. And because of those concerns over the economy, you're seeing that interest rates are going to likely be kept very low over the next couple of years, as long as there's no crazy increase in energy prices or inflation that would drive them back up. As long as the economies continue to do well, as the Portuguese economy has continued to, and with an anticipated growth rate of 2% over the next 2 years, then you're likely to see, and low inflation, then you're likely to see those interest rates remain low as well. The other thing that's going to be affecting the home market here is the amount of home construction that's being done. If you look at this chart, you're going to see that the number of homes being constructed is at the highest level since 2012. And this is really a dramatic increase in the number of units that are being produced, which will ease some of the pressure on the shortage of homes inside of Portugal, and also the shortage of units that are available on the market as well. And according to Idealista, in the third quarter of 2024, the number of homes available on the market increased by 5%, while in a previous quarter they had increased by 10%. So we're seeing a definite increase in the supply of homes that are available on the market, which means even though the pricing of homes has continued to go up because people sense that there's a real shortage of product available in the market, and those units that are in high demand that they really want may develop into a bidding war, there still is an increase of properties available on the market. And I thought it was astounding to see that the number of units available for sale on the market for Porto, for example, has gone up by 30%. So it may have only gone up by 5% in Lisbon, but it's gone up by an astronomical 30% in Porto, which is one of the other really big markets in Portugal. So really, what are the takeaways from this? Yes, we've seen that prices have continued to go up. And we know that they're going up much faster than the rate of inflation. So these are real increases in the value of property. They're not just, which means that once you include inflation, the value of these properties, it's a real increase in real value terms. So the question is, how long can you continue to do this if incomes and investment rates don't rise to meet these increases in the prices? And that's where it begins to become tricky, because you see that the European Central Bank feels that they're going to need to continue to lower rates, even down as low as 2% potentially next year, which means that they feel that the economies are soft and they're going to need super low interest rates to prop them up, which means that if the economies begin to slow, then the number of unemployed people could increase, which means that the demand for housing will be lower, which means that potentially the pricing for housing could be lower as well. That's why you should be careful. I think if you're looking at purchasing a home in the short term, you have to really be sure that it meets your needs. And I'm not a real estate advisor or an investment advisor, so it's really important that you do your research and you figure out exactly what the length of term you intend to own this property for, and if it makes sense for you in that term, and what you believe your willingness to accept risk and the potential risk for buying and holding that property for that length of time. We also know that NHR has gone away, and so you see that its potential for the demand created by that has also slowed now. So in 2024, a lot of people who probably came in under NHR at the end of 2023 were looking for homes, but that demand will also cool then into this year. And we won't really see the effects of that until somewhere in the second half probably of 2025, as people run through that process of initially renting and then potentially buying after they moved here. And then we also see something like the increase in the potential stock of homes, because the increase in construction, which has happened since it's now at the highest levels we've seen homes being finished, and also homes that have been authorized to begin construction are at their highest levels in 12 years. So this is Ted at Valley of the Dolly. In my next video, we'll talk about the latest statistics for renting in Portugal. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you find the information helpful, please hit the like and subscribe button. It really helps. Thanks again. Bye now.